this body section. Inside the head element, are all the elements that are not visible on the page. So here's an example of such an element. We're going to create an element called title. So the text inside the title here is going to change the text in the tab here. So for example, if I use the text first website, that's going to show up in the tab. So if I save and refresh, that's where the title element shows up. But notice that this title element doesn't actually show up on the page, and that's why it belongs in the head section. So the title is the first feature that we get from following this structure. Fresh, that's where the title element shows up. But notice that this title element doesn't actually show up on the page, and that's why it belongs in the head section. So the title is the first feature that we get from following this structure. The second feature that we get that's really useful is the ability to automatically reload our web page whenever we change our code. So you may have noticed that every time we change our code, we have to go to our website and then refresh the page to see our new code. Now we can actually avoid this by following this structure and then installing a VS Code extension. So let's go to this extension area here, and we're going to install the extension Live Server. I'm going to install this. And now we can use the Live Server to reload our page automatically whenever our code changes. To open this website in a live server, we're going to right click and we're going to click Open with Live Server. And now we've opened this website and it will automatically refresh whenever we change our code. So if I change the code like this and I save, now it automatically refreshes without having us to go back and forth. So that's a really useful feature to speed up our development. Now let's get some more practice, and we're going to convert both of these HTML files to use the proper structure. First, I'm going to actually just delete all the extra tabs here. And now let's work on the buttons file. Now, the live server doesn't really work if we don't have that proper HTML structure in our code. So let's add that structure first. I'm going to go up here and we're going to create the structure. So remember, we start with a doc type space HTML. And then I'm going to go up here and we're going to create the structure. So remember, we start with a doc type. Inside, we're going to create a head and we're going to create a body element. And remember, the body contains everything that is visible on the page. So if we scroll down, these three buttons are visible on the page. So we're going to move these into the body element. And now they're in the right place. Now for this style element, remember that we said the style element doesn't actually create anything visible on the page, but it could change the style of other elements. So this is a good example of something that should go in the head element because it doesn't show up first. The button, just delete all the extra tabs, proper structure. First, I'm going to actually just delete all the extra tabs here. And now let's work on the buttons file. Now, the live server doesn't really work if we don't have that proper HTML structure in our code. So let's add that structure first. I'm going to go up here and we're going to create the structure. So remember, we start with a doc type space HTML, and then we're going to create an HTML element. And then inside, we're going to create a head, and we're going to create a body element. And remember, the body contains everything that is visible on the page. So if we scroll down, these three buttons are visible on the page. So we're going to move these into the body element. And now they're in the right place. Now for this style element, remember that we said the style element doesn't actually create anything visible on the page, but it could change the style of other elements. So this is a good example of something that should go in the head element because it doesn't show up visibly on the page. So we're going to copy all of this and put it into the head element. I'm going to go up and we're going to save this in here. So now all of our CSS code is in the right place. And now that we have the proper structure, we can open this with our live server just to make sure everything looks good. Let's go here and add a title like we learned. And this is going to change the text at the top of the tab. So let's call this Buttons Practice. Save it, and you'll notice that it automatically reloads. Now we're going to learn another feature that we get from following this structure. If we look at our code, we have all of our CSS code together along with our HTML code. Now this gets confusing because we have a lot of lines of code and we're mixing two different languages. To solve this problem, we can move all of our CSS HTML code. Now we're going to title like we learned, and this is going to change the text at the top of the tab. So let's call this Buttons Practice. Save it, and you'll notice that it automatically reloads. Now we're going to learn another feature that we get from following this structure. If we look at our code, we have all of our CSS code together along with our HTML code. Now this feature to speed up our development. Now let's get some more practice, and we're going to convert both of these HTML files to use the proper structure. First, I'm going to actually just delete all the extra tabs here. And now let's work on the buttons file. Now the live server doesn't really work if we don't have that proper HTML structure in our code. So let's add that structure first. I'm going to go up here and we're going to create the structure. So remember, we start with a doc type space HTML, and then we're going to create an HTML element. The structure, so remember, we start with a use void elements to you one by one. Search for Google. This structure. Let's go back to our very first HTML file. And at the top, I'm going to add some spaces, and we're going to learn what the proper structure is. Every HTML file is going to start with to it. We just have to make sure everything looks good. Because it doesn't require a closing tag like we've seen so far. Elements like these are called void elements. So if we search for Google and we search void elements HTML, this will give us a list of elements that don't need a closing tag. So these are the exceptions to the rule that everything has to have a closing tag. So don't worry too much about memorizing all of these. You'll get more used to it the more that you write HTML. And I'll introduce void elements to you one by one. So here we're going to learn our first void element into a different file. So let's copy all of this, and we're going to create a new file to just contain our CSS. We're going to go here and create a new file, and let's call it buttons.css. Make sure your file ends in .css to tell the computer that this file contains CSS code. And now we're going to move our code into that file. And save. and save here. Now you'll notice that we lost all of our styles, and that's because we now need to load this new CSS file into our HTML. To do that, we're going to learn a new element called the link element. So the link is sort of a special element because it doesn't require a closing tag like we've seen so far. Elements like these are called void elements. So if we search for Google and we search void elements HTML, this will give us a list of elements that don't need a closing tag. So these are the exceptions to the rule that everything has to have a closing tag. So don't worry too much about memorizing all of these. You'll get more used to it the more that you write HTML. And I'll introduce void elements to you one by one. So here we're going to learn our first void element, which doesn't need a code into that file. And save. And save here. Now you'll notice that we lost all of our styles, and that's because we now need to load this new CSS file into our HTML. To do that, move our code into that file. And save. And save here. And save. And save here. Now you'll notice that we lost all of our styles, and that's because we now need to load this new CSS file into our HTML. To do that, we're going to learn a new element called the link element. So the link is sort of a special element because it doesn't require a closing tag like we've seen so far. Elements like these are called void elements. So if we search for Google and we search void elements that don't use to it. So here we're going to learn our first void element, which doesn't need a closing tag, but this element takes two attributes. The first one is called REL, which stands for relation. So what kind of thing are we linking in? In this case, we're going to link in a style sheet. And then we have to tell it another attribute, which is href. So this tells a link what file we're going to link into this file. So here we're going to link our CSS file into our HTML. So we're going to link buttons.css. Okay, now let's go back to our page. You notice we don't have our styles. And now when I save this, we get all of our styles back. And that's because we're loading all the CSS code found in buttons.css, which is all the code we had before, into our HTML. So this is another way to load CSS without having to write it all in our HTML file. Now the big benefit of this is that each file contains less code and each file contains one type of code. So in this file, we only have html.css. Okay, now let's go back to our page. You notice we don't have our styles. And now when I save this, we get all of our styles back. And that's because we're loading all the CSS code found in buttons.css, which is all the code we had before, into our HTML. So this is another way to load CSS without having to write it all in our HTML file. Now the big benefit of this is that each file contains less code, and each file contains one type of code. So in this file, we only have HTML code, and in this file, we only have CSS code. So it makes the files smaller and more focused, and that's going to help us develop easier. Now, before we move on, I do want to talk about the href attribute. So the way that the computer finds this file is that it's going to search right beside our HTML file. So it's going to search right beside the file that this code is in. So it's going to look for a file called buttons.css. It finds it and it loads it into our HTML. But if this file was in a folder, let's create a new folder. Let's call this styles. Let's put the CSS file in our new folder. And now you notice that the styles are gone. And that's because this link can't find buttons.css anymore. What it's trying to do is it's trying to look for a file called buttons.css beside our HTML, and there's nothing there. So to link a file that's inside a folder, you first have to give the name of the folder that's beside the HTML file. In this case, it's styles. Next, we have to type a slash. So this slash means we're going into the styles folder. And then inside, this is basically, and now our file path. Now let's get some more practice, and we're going to convert our final file into the proper HTML structure. So let's create the structure first because we can't use live server just yet. We're going to write a doc type space HTML at the top. And then we're going to have an HTML element. And then inside, we're going to have a head element. And then we're going to have a body element. Now everything that is visible is going to go inside the body. So if we scroll down, all of our paragraphs are going to go inside the body. And we're going to do some more practice. We're going to set up here, and we're going to move all of this into a CSS file. CSS. And we're going to move all of the CSS code into there. So next let's create a link element and href style sheet. And the file is located right beside the HTML file. So all we need to do is link text.css where we were. Again, let's practice moving this into a folder. But we're going to use a slash to go inside, and we're going to link this text.css file. Another one that we've seen is called Times New Roman. That's basically the font that we get on a fresh website. Now, in addition to these default fonts, we can actually load new fonts from the internet, and we're going to learn how to do that within this structure. So let's go to our webpage. And Google actually provides a lot of really great free fonts that we can use. So we're going to open a new tab, and we're going to search for Google Fonts. And we're going to go into this first link. Now, this website might look a little different for you, but the general process is the same. First, we're going to search for a font that we like. So a good font to use here is Roboto. And this is the font that we're going to use for our final project. We're going to pick this font, and then inside here, we're going to pick the styles that we want. So for example, I'm going to pick the regular style, and I'm also going to pick the bold style here. So I'm going to pick the bold style. And then I'm going to go to the basket of fonts that I selected, and then Google is going to give me the code that I need to load these fonts. All we need to do is copy this code exactly and then put it in our head section of our HTML. So we're going to put it in our structure in this head section. And now we've loaded a new font that we can use on our website. So now let's go back to our website and we're going to use this new font. So remember that currently we set our fonts to Arial. This time we loaded the font called Roboto, and that's what we're going to use. So let's change Arial here to Roboto. Now when I save, the font is going to change. And there you go. It might not look that much different because Roboto is very similar to Arial, but if we inspect and we click on this element and go to the Computed tab, we'll see that the font family has now been changed to Roboto. So this is now when I save, the font is going to change. Roboto is very similar to font website. So we're going to put it in our structure in our head section of our HTML. So we're going to put it in our structure in this head section. And now we've loaded a new font that we can use on our website. So now let's go. Look that much different because Roboto is very similar to Arial, but if we inspect tab, we'll see that our website. So those are the features that we get from following this HTML structure. Now we're ready to work on the final project of this course, recreating YouTube.com. Just like before, I've created a page on my website that'll show us what the final project looks like. So first, we're going to close all of our browser tabs because we're going to start over again. And then we're going to open a new page. And we're going to go to supersimple.dev. And we're going to go to supersimple.dev/exercises/YouTube. So on this page, you can see what our final project will look like. So we're going to learn how to recreate YouTube.com that you see here. So first, let's set up our project in our code editor. So let's go into here and let's actually create a folder that's going to contain all of our previous code. So the final project is going to contain a lot of code, so we don't want to get it confused with the previous lessons. So let's call this intro-to-html. And we're going to put everything inside this folder. I'm going to put this in here and these HTML files in here as well. Next, we're going to create a new HTML file for our final project. So let's create a file called youtube.html. And I actually put it inside this folder. I'm going to take it out by dragging it down here. So now we have an intro to HTML folder and our youtube.html, and we're ready to get started. First, we're going to set up the proper structure of HTML that we learned in the previous lesson. So we're going to start off with a less than exclamation doc type and HTML. And then we're going to create an HTML element that's going to contain our entire web page. And inside here, we're going to have a head element. And we're also going to have a body element. And now that we have the structure, we can open it with Live Server. And now we have our blank page. So this page is going to automatically reload when we change our code. Now, before we can work on the final project, we need to learn two more HTML elements: how to load images onto our website and how to create a search box. So let's start with loading images first. So I'm going to show you how you can download these thumbnails from my website. We're going to right-click in a blank area and inspect. And now if we click this icon in the top left and hover over an image and click it, and you might need to drag this down to see the HTML, we can find the image and inspect. And now if we click this icon in the top left and hover over an image and click it, and you might need to drag this down to see the HTML, we can find the image in the HTML, and here is the URL for the image. So we can actually click this and it will open the image in a new tab, and we can Control S to save it. So make sure we save this image in the folder that contains all of our code. So that's this folder for me. I'm going to save it. And now in my code editor, I can see the image. Next, we're going to create an HTML element to load this onto our page. So I'm going to go back to my page here, and then we're going to go into the body and create the image element, which is less than img greater than. Now the image element is unique because it's another void element. So we mentioned void elements briefly in the previous lesson. It's an element that doesn't require a closing tag. So this is one of those exceptions to the rule. So the image element takes one attribute called src. Now this attribute tells the computer which image to display on the website. So for us, that image is the one we downloaded called thumbnail1.webp. So we're going to display thumbnail-1.webp. And when I save it, the image is now loaded onto our website. So this source attribute works the same way as the link attribute that we saw earlier. It follows the rules of file paths to locate our file. So just as a reminder, if we type thumbnail1.webp here, it's going to look for a file named thumbnail1.webp right beside our HTML file. It's going to find it and then load it onto our website. But now we're actually going to create a folder because we have multiple thumbnails and we want to organize them. We're going to create a folder called thumbnails. And we're going to drag this into that folder. So now for this source attribute, we don't have a file beside our HTML called thumbnail1.webp, and then you see this error here. So this means that there is an error loading an image. Now to find it in the thumbnails file, we're going to type thumbnails/thumbnail1.webp. So first, it's going to look for a file or folder called thumbnails beside the HTML file. It finds this one, and then the slash here means to go inside the folder and then find this file inside that folder, which is here. So that's how we load images onto our page. Now we're going to learn how to style our image elements. So let's go into our head section here and create a style element. Now before we do that, I forgot to do something, which is let's create a title for our page. So we can call this youtube.com clone. And if we save this, the title will show up in the tabs. All right, so let's learn how to style our image. So as always, we're going to give it a class attribute. And let's just call this thumbnail. And now we can target this class in our CSS. So dot thumbnail. Now all of the CSS properties that we learned so far apply to the image. Some of them make sense and some of them don't. So one property that obviously doesn't make sense is something like font-size. So if I save it, you'll see nothing changes because there is no text inside this element. It's an image. So even though this works, it doesn't really change anything. Now a property that does make sense for an image is width. So this will set the width of this image. Let's make it smaller to match what we have here. So let's make the width something like 300 pixels. Now we save it, and now the width of this image is 300 pixels. Now we save it, and now the width of this image is 300 pixels. So one thing you might notice is that when we set the width of an image, the height also changes. So before we had this, notice that the image was a lot taller. But as soon as we set the width, the height also adjusts. So that's one behavior of images that we should know. When we set the width, the height will also adjust so that the image has the same dimensions. What I mean by same dimensions is that it keeps the same shape. So for example, if I set the height as well, this is going to cause the image to lose its shape or lose its dimensions. Let's set the height to something like 600 pixels. Save it. And now you'll see that the image is 600 pixels tall, but it's lost its shape and now it's become stretched. So that behavior of an image sort of keeps us safe. So it keeps the image looking nice. Now, if we really wanted an image that was exactly 300 pixels by 300 pixels, what can we do? So this image, as you can see, is getting stretched out. So in addition to all the CSS properties that we've learned so far, the image element has its own properties that are specific to an image. So one of these is called object fit. So this determines what happens if this size doesn't match the image's dimensions or the image's shape. So for example, I can set a value of cover. So this tells the image to cover this 300 by 300 area, but it's also going to keep its shape. So this area might not be big enough to show the whole image, which may or may not be okay depending on what we want to do. Now we can adjust which part of the image that we see using another property called object-position. So currently we're looking at the center of the image. We can set the object position to left to view the left side of the image, or we can also set it to the right to view the right side of the image, in the case that the image doesn't fit in our area. Another value we can give to object fit is contain. So if we save this, the entire image is going to shrink until it is contained in this 300 by 300 area. So I'm going to set a border so that we can see what this is doing. I'm going to set a border of 2 pixels, border width of 2 pixels, border style of solid, border color of red. So here the border shows us our 300 by 300 area, and contain makes the image shrink until it is contained in the area. But that means that it might not be able to cover the entire area if it's not the right shape. So in this case, the object position can move the image to the top or to the bottom. So that's basically how images work. As you can see, a lot of the CSS properties that we learned before, like width and height and border, can be applied to the image element, and the image element also has some of its own properties that determine how the image is displayed. So for now, let's create something that's kind of like our final website. So I'm going to set the image width to 300, and I'm not going to set a height so that the image doesn't stretch and we don't have to do all this stuff. And I can actually just remove all of this. So the only thing I'm doing is telling the image to shrink down to a width of 300 and to shrink the height as well so that the image keeps its shape. So we're going to stick with this for now, and this is going to correspond to this part of our final project. And we're going to start learning how to build out the entire video preview. The next element we're going to learn in this lesson is how to create search boxes like the one you see up here. So let's go back into our website and we'll learn the code for creating a search box. The HTML for creating a text box is less than input greater than. So the input element is a void element, just like the image element. It doesn't require a closing tag. So the input element has several attributes that we can give it. One of them is called the type. So if we set the type equals text, it's going to give us a text box. I'm going to save this, and now in our HTML, you can see we have a text box. Another type that we can give to this input is called checkbox. So if I save this, now we have a checkbox. So for our purposes, we're going to set the type to a text box because we want to create the YouTube search box up here. So you also notice that this text box has the word search in it. And when I start typing, that search word is gone. So this is sort of like a label for the user, telling them what to put into this text box. And this is known as a placeholder. So if we go back to our website, we're going to add a placeholder to our new text box. To do that, we're just going to give the attribute placeholder. And let's set the placeholder as search. If we save it, now we have a placeholder that disappears when we start typing. So that's how we create what we see on YouTube. So for the text box, all of the CSS properties that we learned so far can be used on the text box. So let's look at some examples. Let's add a class attribute first, like always, so that we can target it. Let's call it search-bar. And then inside our CSS, we're going to target .search-bar class. And then inside, we can set our usual CSS properties. So for example, in this case, we can set a font-size. And let's set it to 20 pixels. Save it and reload. And now you can see that the font size has changed. Another thing we can change is margin, or the spacing. So let's add some margin to the left of 12 pixels. Save it, and now we have some spacing on the left. So basically everything that we've learned so far about CSS properties, we can use on the search box. For now, let's remove these example styles, and we're going to style the search box to look like our final project later in this course. In this lesson, we're going to learn one of the most important CSS properties called the display property, and we're going to use this to start building out our final project. We're going to start off by taking a look at our final project, and we're going to start building out the text here. So we're going to create paragraphs for these text. So let's go into our code, and we're going to create 3 paragraphs. So here's one of them, and we can copy the text. So copy and paste. So here's another paragraph, and we're going to copy this and paste it in our code. And here's the final paragraph. Our code. And here's the final paragraph. And we'll save. So here I'm actually going to use the HTML entity again instead of this special character. So to save us some time, I'm just going to type it out here. Now I'm going to save this and go back to my web page. And now we have the text that we're going to use. But you might notice something weird. How come this text box is beside our image? If we look at our paragraphs, they are on top of each other, so one after another on each line. How come text boxes and images appear on the same line? So this is due to the display property in CSS, and we're going to learn what that is right now. In HTML, there are 3 types of elements. The first type of element is called a block element. A block element takes up the entire line. So a paragraph by default is a block element. We can see that in our DevTools by right-clicking in the browser, and then clicking Inspect, and then clicking this icon in the top left, right here, and then hovering over our paragraph. So you can see that even though the text goes to here, the paragraph extends to the end of the line, because the paragraph by default is a block element. Block elements take up the entire line. So let's go into our code, and I'm going to demonstrate another property of block elements. If we set a class on the paragraph and we style it, so let's set a class of video-title. Let's save it, and we're going to style it, and let's give it a width of 300 pixels. Save and refresh. And now this paragraph is only 300 pixels. So it's fresh of 300 pixels. Save and refresh. And now this paragraph is only 300 pixels. So it's not stretching to the end of the line anymore. Let's verify that using the DevTools by clicking this top left and then hovering over. So you see that the paragraph itself only takes a width of 300 like we set in our CSS, but it still takes up the entire line, denoted by the orange part on the right here. If we click on this paragraph and we go to the Computed tab, notice that there is no margin on the right side, but we still have a ton of orange area on the right. So this is how block elements work. Regardless of how much space they actually take up the entire line. So they're forced to be on their own line, like this paragraph and these 2 paragraphs. So that's what a block element means. The second type of element is an inline block element. An inline block element only takes up as much space as it needs to and doesn't take up the entire line. An example of an inline block element is the image element and the input element. They only take up as much space as they need to, and they don't take up the entire line. So another element could appear beside them, like we see here. So that's the inline block element. The third type of basic HTML element is called the inline element. Inline elements are basically just text elements. They appear within a line of text. So if you remember, we briefly introduced the element strong. So this element appears within a line of text like this. So this element makes a part of the text bold, and it appears within a line of text. So those are the three basic types of HTML elements: a block element, which takes up the entire line, an inline block element, which only takes up as much space as it needs to, and an inline element, which appears within a line of text. Now, the most interesting of these three are the block elements and the inline block elements, because they determine how these elements are displayed on the page, whether beside each other or above and below. In addition, we can use a CSS property called display to easily switch between block and inline block. So let's see how that would work. So first, let's start by switching from block to inline block. We're going to switch both of these paragraphs to inline block elements. Let's go into our code, and we're going to give this a class. Let's call this video-author. And let's call this video-stats. And we're going to style these classes. So we're going to style the video-author, as well as the video stats. And we're going to set both of these to display inline dash block. And this one as well, display inline dash block. I'm going to introduce a little bit of CSS syntax here. If we have two sets of CSS styles that are the same, we can actually use a different syntax by adding a comma here. So this comma means that we're going to target both the video author class and the video stats class with this set of styles. So this is how we target multiple things in CSS with a comma. So as you can see, these two elements now appear beside each other. They're both inline block elements and only take up as much space as they need to. If we click the top left in the DevTools and hover over this, you'll notice that this paragraph is now only taking up as much space as the text, and the same thing for this paragraph. So as you can see, even though paragraphs by default are block elements, we can change them very easily to inline block with the display property so that we can put them beside each other. Next, we're going to try the opposite direction. We're going to go from an inline block element to a block element. And we're going to put these two on separate lines. So let's go into our code, and we're going to style the thumbnail class. So I'm going to scroll up here, and I'm going to convert this to display block. And now it will turn the image into a display block, and this will cause the image to take up the entire line, pushing the text box down to the next line. If I save it, now you can see that this image is taking up the entire line. We're going to verify this by clicking the top left and then hovering over this image. So using this property, we can control whether an element appears on the same line or on a different line. And that's what we're going to do to copy this design. The search bar is at the top. We have an image and then 3 paragraphs, each on a different line. So we're going to use the display property to achieve this. Let's go into our code, and first let's put the search box at the top. I'm going to save it. And since our image is already display block, it's going to take up the entire line, so it's forced to take up a line below the search box. So I think this is pretty good. As long as the search box is up there, then we're good to go. Next, we're going to turn these back into display block because we want these on separate lines, like our design here. So to do that, we're going to go into our code, and we could change this to display block, but remember that paragraphs by default are display block. So we can just get rid of this code. Save it, and now our elements are appearing at least in the same structure as the design, from top to bottom, and each element is taking up its own line. So that is the display property. It allows us to control how an element is displayed, whether they're a block element and take up the whole line, or they're an inline block element and only take up as much space as they need to. In this lesson, we're going to learn about the most important HTML element called the div element. For example, here's twitter.com. If you look at the HTML that Twitter uses, you can see that they're using lots and lots of divs. Here's another example, Instagram. If we look at Instagram's HTML, we can also see that they're using lots and lots of divs. So what exactly is a div, and why is it used so much? So the div element stands for division, but an easy way to understand this is that the div is just a box. We're going to go into our code and look at an example. So below our paragraphs, let's create a div element. And inside, we're going to have some text. This is a div. Save it, and now we have our first div element on the page. To show you that the div is just a box, we're going to right-click and inspect. And then we're going to click this top left icon and hover over the div. So as you can see, we created a box around our text. You'll notice that this box stretches to the end, and that's because the div, like the paragraph, by default is a block element, so it takes up the entire line. But like we learned in the previous lesson, we can easily change this to an inline block using the display property. So let's go ahead and do that, and it'll be more clear that this is really a box. So we're going to set a class here. We're going to call this div-example. And now we're going to say our content is, why is a div so useful? The key feature of now, we only have some text inside this div, but we can actually put paragraphs, divs. Divs project, we use containers everywhere. So at the YouTube design that we have in our project, here's another container. We use containers everywhere. So here's a container, here's another container, and here's another container. These containers allow us to group all of these elements together so that we can create a layout that looks like this. Here's another example from Twitter. Here's a container, here's another container, and here's another container. In order to build a complex real-world website, we need containers to group our elements together and lay them out on the page. And the div is the perfect solution for this container problem, and that's why it's used so much. Let's go back to our website, and we're going to practice using our div as a container. So we're going to create a container, just like our final project, for this entire video preview here. So that means we're going to put all of these elements, this image and all three paragraphs, inside our div. Let's see how that works. So I'm going to get rid of this text first, and then I'm going to change this div to a class of video-preview, because this is going to contain all these elements that are part of a video preview. And then I'm going to move the image and the three paragraphs into the div. Now save. And you might not notice any difference because the div is simply just drawing a box around the content inside. But we can right-click and inspect and we can see the div in our HTML here. And inside the div, we have our image and our paragraphs. The div is just creating a box around all this content. So now I'll show you why containers are so useful. We're going to go into our code and we're going to change the width of our div element here. So we're going to go up here and we can remove this. Let's style the video preview class. And we're going to set a width of 300 pixels. Let's see how that looks. So the page doesn't look any different, but if we click the icon in the top left and then hover over our paragraphs, we'll notice something interesting. This paragraph is a block element, so it's supposed to take up the entire line. But in this case, because this paragraph is inside a div, it takes up the entire line in the div. So the way that block elements actually work is that they take up the entire line in their container rather than on the page. So that's really useful because if we look at our final project, so for these paragraphs, we want them to appear on separate lines like this. So we do want them to take up their own line, but we don't necessarily want them to take up the line on the entire page because we have some stuff on the right side here. So to solve this problem, we put the paragraphs inside a container so that they take up their own line in the container and not in the page. And that's how we can create a layout like this. Let's go back to our website. If we hover over our div now, so this blue box on the left is our container. It groups all the elements together and keeps it within that blue area that you see. Now, a really cool thing about this is that notice that the blue box doesn't actually take up the entire page. So we can actually have a second box beside it on the right. So we can add another blue box on the right containing another video preview. So now we're going to do that. But first of all, a div by default is a block element. So now box on the right containing another video preview. So now we're going to do that. But first of all, a div by default is a block element. So notice on the right side, it's all orange. That's because this div is taking up the entire line. In this case, we don't want it to take up the entire line anymore. That's why we're going to convert it into an inline block element. So let's go into our code. We're going to go into the video preview and we're going to type display inline block. Let's save it. And now you can see that our div is a display inline block. And it's actually appearing beside our search bar because this is also an inline block. So they're both only taking up as much space as they need to, and now they can appear beside each other. However, we do want the search box to be at the top in its own line. So we're going to practice using the display property again. We're going to set the search bar to display block so that it takes up the entire line and everything else is forced below it. Let's save it and refresh. And now if we hover over this input element, we can see that we forced it to take up the entire line. Next, we're going to create another video preview beside this one. Because this is inline block now, we can put another div here. So I'm just going to simplify this by making a copy of our current code. So I'm just going to copy and paste. And now we have 2 video previews. Save it. And there we go. We now have 2 video previews beside each other. So they are 2 containers right beside each other. And remember, in our CSS, we set the width of these containers to 300 pixels. So that's the amount of space that they take. And we set their display to inline block. So they don't take up the entire line and they can appear beside each other. And now we're on our way to creating a layout that looks like this. In fact, let's actually replace the second video preview here with this content. So to do that, we're going to download and we're going to Control S code here. Next, we're going to swap out the thumbnails. So I'm going to change just for an example. And I'm also going to change the channel name here, T-Million. If I say this, we have 2 different video previews, but now we have a problem. You'll notice that these 2 aren't aligned with each other. And that's because this container is actually a little bit taller than this one. This piece of text here wraps around to a second line while this one does not. However, to make it look better, we want to align these at the top. So we learned this way back in one of the earlier lessons, and we're going to review how to do that. We're going to go into our code, and we just have to set this property, vertical align. And we're going to set it to top so that these elements align at the top. I'm going to save it, and now that looks pretty good. We now have 2 different video previews, and they are aligned with each other. The last thing we'll do is to add some space between them. So remember, the space outside of an element is called margin. And we're going to add margin to this entire container right now. So we'll go into our code, and in the video preview styles, we're going to add margin dash right. And let's set it to something like 15 pixels. Save it, and now we added margin on the right. And now the interesting thing about this is if we right click and inspect, and then in our HTML, we find our div, which is here, you'll see that the margin is applied on the entire div. So that's how the div element works. It's a container that groups other elements together so that we can create complex layouts like this and eventually our YouTube project. All right, so this is probably the most important lesson of this course. We're going to learn a technique called the nested layouts technique. And this is going to get us to a professional level with HTML and CSS. So what is the nested layouts technique? The basic idea is that there are 2 types of layouts. The first one is a vertical layout, which looks like this, where items are on top of each other. And then the second one is a horizontal layout, which looks like this, where items are beside each other. And by using a combination of vertical and horizontal layouts, we can create almost anything that we see on a website. So for example, let's take the YouTube video preview that we've been working on. We can break this down by using a vertical layout, and then inside this vertical layout, we're going to have a horizontal layout. And then inside this horizontal layout, we're going to have a vertical layout. So as you can see, we have layouts inside layouts inside layouts. And that's why it's called the nested layouts technique. And using this, we can pretty much break down almost everything that we see on a professional website into a series of layouts and then recreate them using our code. So now we're going to go through together a way that we can practice using the nested layouts technique to break down a design. We're going to go to our final project. If you close it, you can go to supersimple.dev/exercises/YouTube. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a screenshot of one of these designs, and then we're going to use an image editing software to draw out the layout. So first, let's create a screenshot. On Windows, you can use an app called Snip. On Mac, we're going to type Command Shift and 4 to create a screenshot. So let's take a screenshot of this. And then we're going to upload this into an image editing software. Now, feel free to use anything that you're comfortable with, but if you don't know what to use, we can go to a new tab, and we're going to search for Google Drawings. And we're going to use this to practice the nested layouts technique. So once we have this open, we're going to upload our image. I'm going to go to my computer and upload the screenshot. And now we're just going to draw some rectangles to represent our layout. So we're going to go up here to shapes, and we're going to create a rectangle. And first, we're going to create a vertical layout 1 and 2. So I'm just going to draw a rectangle here. Let's change the background to transparent so we can see what's underneath. And I'll make the border a little more thick and change it to red so it's easier to see. And now I'm going to copy this and paste it to create a duplicate. And I'm just going to move it down here and resize the rectangle like this. All right, so just like that, we created a vertical layout. For now, don't worry about the video time here. We're going to recreate this later in the course using another feature of CSS. And now, looking at our design, we have a horizontal layout 1 and 2. So to create a horizontal layout, we're going to draw it out again using rectangles. So let's go in here, and we're going to create another rectangle. And we're going to draw out the horizontal layout like this. So here's one. Change the background to transparent. Make it bold. And I'm going to use the blue color to represent a horizontal layout. Now I'm going to copy this and paste it here and resize it a little bit like that. And now we have our horizontal layout. And finally, inside here, we're going to have a vertical layout like this. So again, we're just going to keep drawing rectangles. I'm going to copy this and paste it and move it down here and resize it a little bit so that we can see it. So right here, and then copy this and then paste it again. We're going to create the second part of our vertical layout. And then copy this, move it down here and resize it a little bit so that we can see it. So right here, and then copy this and then paste it again. We're going to create the second part of our vertical layout like that, and then copy and paste it one last time down here. So that's how we use the nested layouts technique to visualize and break down a design into a combination of vertical layouts and horizontal layouts. Now let's do some more practice. We're going to take another design and break that down using this technique. So we're going to open a new tab and we're going to go to twitter.com/supersimpledev. And we're going to just take one of my tweets here and take a screenshot of this. Now we're going to, so let's take a look at this to see out 1 and 2 rectangle layout this. Do a vertical, and I'm just going to draw it, style it a little bit and make it red to represent the vertical layout down here to get 3. We have a horizontal, also break this. Actually, I'm going to here. And finally, we can break this part and paste it here. And I'm just going to create a few of them like this. So just like that, we broke down this design into a combination of vertical and horizontal layouts using the nested layouts technique. So now that we have a good understanding of how this works, we're going to learn how to recreate this using code. So let's go back into our project. I'm going to delete all of these extra tabs here. So we're going to go from something that looks like this to something that looks like our final design here. Now, before we start, we actually need to download this channel profile picture. So remember, to do that, we can right click and inspect, click the top left icon here, and then click this picture. And we have the URL to download it here. So I'm going to hover over it, scroll down, and click this link. Now Control S to save, and I'm going to save it in the folder that contains our code, which is right here. And now this should show up in our code editor. So I'm actually going to create a folder to store all of these channel profile pictures since we're going to have a lot of them. So I'm going to call this channel-pictures. And I'll put this in there. Now we're ready to create our layouts. So let's go back to our final design and see what kind of layouts we have. So we're going to have a vertical layout. It's 1 and 2, so 2 rows. And then inside the second row, we're going to have a horizontal layout, which is 1 and 2. Now inside the second horizontal layout, we're going to have a vertical layout, 1, 2, and 3. So that's how we're going to break down this design. And again, don't worry about the video time here. We're going to recreate this later in the course. Let's go into our code and we're going to implement that. So make sure that we have our project open on the left here. And we're going to start by creating some vertical layouts. To create a vertical layout, we're going to create 2